Have you ever heard your own name spoken with so little love that, for the first time, you wondered if the people sitting around your dinner table had already stopped seeing you as family? What would you do if the only thing keeping you alive in their eyes was the paperwork that hadn't been signed yet? Most people think betrayal announces itself with shouting, slammed doors, or ugly arguments. Mine arrived wrapped in laughter, carried through the air from the next room, while I sat quietly in my favorite chair with a book I wasn't even reading. That was the night I learned. I'd spent 43 years building a family, only to discover they had already started, dividing the life I'd worked so hard to create. My name is Thomas, and I'm 74 years old. I wasn't a millionaire, but I'd done well enough. A successful construction business, a paid-off home overlooking the lake, a comfortable retirement account, and a few investments that had quietly grown over the decades. Nothing extravagant, just the reward of a lifetime spent leaving for work, before sunrise and coming home long after everyone else had finished dinner. Every dollar had a story behind it. Every brick in that house reminded me of a sacrifice I'd made for the people I loved. That Sunday evening was supposed to be ordinary. My wife had insisted we invite everyone over for dinner. Our 2 children came with their spouses, and even my youngest grandson spent most of the evening running through the house, laughing loud enough to make me forget my aching knees. Looking back now, I realize everyone seemed unusually attentive. My glass was never empty. My wife kept asking if I felt tired. My daughter offered to help organize my office. At the time, I thought they were simply being thoughtful. It's amazing how kindness can look genuine until you learn the reason behind it. After dinner, I excused myself, saying I wanted to rest for a while. That wasn't unusual. At my age, everyone expected me to disappear into the den with a blanket, and a book before dessert was even served. I settled into my chair, leaving the door slightly open because I liked hearing my family's voices echo through the house. I used to think those sounds were proof that I'd built something meaningful. Then I heard my son say, "The lake house should really stay in the family. We just need to make sure Mom gets everything transferred smoothly." The room went quiet for a second before someone laughed. Another voice answered, "As long as Dad doesn't change anything at the last minute." My fingers tightened around the armrest. I wasn't supposed to hear this. I knew that immediately. I should have walked into the dining room. I should have asked them exactly what they meant. But something inside me, something I'd relied on for decades while negotiating difficult business deals, told me to stay exactly where I was. So I listened. Over the next several minutes, they spoke about my savings, my investments, my truck, my watches, even the tools I'd collected over a lifetime. They weren't wondering whether I'd enjoy another Christmas or another birthday. They were calmly discussing who deserved what after I was gone, as though my death wasn't a tragedy waiting to happen, but a schedule that had simply been delayed. Then my wife said the one sentence that changed everything. "Just be patient," she said softly. "He trusts me completely." In that moment, my heart didn't break. It became very, very quiet, and that's when I made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to interrupt them. I was going to let them finish every single plan. Because people who believe they've already won usually tell you far more than they ever intended. People often ask what betrayal feels like. They imagine a sharp pain, something dramatic that knocks the air out of your lungs. The truth is much stranger. It feels like silence. A silence so heavy that every memory you've ever treasured suddenly asks the same question. Was any of it real? I sat in that chair long after their conversation drifted to other things, staring at the fireplace without seeing it. My family thought they were discussing my future. In reality, they had just erased my past. The strangest part wasn't what they said. It was how comfortable they sounded saying it. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no awkward pauses. They spoke as if these conversations had happened before, more than once, maybe dozens of times. That thought hurt more than anything else. It meant I hadn't overheard the beginning of their plan. I'd overheard the middle. When everyone finally left that evening, my wife walked into the den carrying a cup of tea, smiling the same gentle smile I'd seen for more than 40 years. "You fell asleep in here," she said. I looked at her for a long moment before taking the cup. I guess I did. It wasn't a lie. The man she thought she'd married had fallen asleep. The man sitting in front of her now was paying attention. Over the next few days, I stopped speaking as much and started watching instead. It's amazing what people reveal when they believe you've stopped noticing. My son suddenly wanted to know where I kept important documents. My daughter insisted she could help. organize my financial records, so things would be easier later. My wife casually asked whether I still remembered the password to our investment account. Each question sounded innocent by itself. Together they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Then I remembered something that had seemed insignificant only weeks earlier. My wife had encouraged me to skip my annual appointment with my estate attorney. "You're healthy," she'd said with a laugh. "Why waste the money?" At the time, I thought she was being practical. Now I wondered if she was being strategic. That realization kept me awake most of the night. The following morning, instead of driving to the golf course like I usually did every Tuesday, I drove to the office of the attorney, who had handled my affairs for nearly 20 years. I didn't call ahead. I simply walked in and asked if he had a few minutes. When he saw my face, his smile disappeared. "Thomas," he said quietly, "is everything all right?" I closed the door behind me. "No," I answered. "I think my family is waiting for me to die." He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he folded his hands across his desk and asked a question I wasn't expecting. "What makes you believe that?" For the next hour, I repeated every word I'd overheard. He listened without interrupting, occasionally writing notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Before we discuss what to do next," he said, "there's something you need to check immediately." I frowned. "What is it?" He slid a folder across the desk. "I want to know whether anyone has tried to gain access to your financial records, because this may be bigger than a family conversation." I stared at the folder without opening it. For the first time since that Sunday night, I realized my family's plan might not have been about waiting for my wealth. Someone may have already started reaching for it. I wish I could tell you that opening that folder gave me answers. Instead, it gave me something much worse, questions I never thought I'd have to ask about the people I loved most. Have you ever reached a point where you weren't afraid of the truth anymore, only of how much of it there might be? That's where I found myself that morning, sitting across from my attorney, realizing that trust can disappear in a single conversation, but rebuilding it is almost impossible. Inside the folder was a record of recent activity, related to my financial accounts and estate documents. Nothing had been stolen, not yet, but there had been several requests for information over the previous few months. Copies of property records had been requested. Questions had been asked about beneficiary procedures. Someone had even contacted one of my financial institutions, asking what documentation would be required if I became mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. Every request had been denied because proper authorization wasn't provided. Legally, nothing improper had happened. Emotionally, everything had. My attorney looked me straight in the eyes. "Thomas, these could be innocent inquiries, but after what you've told me, I wouldn't assume that." Neither would I. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts, even if they weren't pleasant. I replayed every family gathering from the past year, every unexpected act of kindness, every question about my health, every suggestion that I should slow down or let someone else handle the paperwork. One by one, the pieces began fitting together like a puzzle I'd never wanted to solve. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to accuse anyone. Accusations make people defensive. Silence makes them comfortable. And comfortable people make mistakes. That afternoon, my son stopped by unexpectedly. "Dad," he said with a cheerful grin, "I was thinking maybe we should simplify some things for you. You don't need to worry about bills and investments anymore. You've worked hard enough." A week earlier, those words would have warmed my heart. Now they sounded rehearsed. I smiled. "You might be right," I said. "I've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately." His shoulders relaxed so quickly that he didn't even realize I'd noticed. That was the moment I understood something important. They wanted me to look vulnerable, so I decided to give them exactly what they were hoping to see. Over the next 2 weeks, I became forgetful on purpose. I'd ask the same harmless question twice. I'd pretend to misplace my reading glasses even when they were in my pocket. I'd occasionally pause before answering simple questions, then laugh it off by saying, "Guess old age is catching up with me." Each tiny performance made my family more confident. I could see it in their eyes. They stopped being careful around me. Conversations became quieter, but not quiet enough. One evening, I walked into the kitchen just as everyone fell silent. My daughter quickly changed the subject. My wife forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Years ago, I would have believed them. Not anymore. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, My attorney and I were doing the exact opposite of what my family expected. We reviewed every account, every deed, every investment, every insurance policy, and every legal document I'd signed over the past decade. We didn't change anything yet. We simply mapped out every possible weakness before making a single move. Patience, my attorney reminded me. The strongest case isn't built by reacting. It's built by understanding. I nodded, because I had a feeling the worst betrayal was still ahead of me. And 3 days later, it arrived. I came home from my morning walk earlier than usual. The front door was unlocked. As I stepped inside, I heard voices coming from my home office. Then I heard my wife say quietly, "Check the top drawer. That's where he keeps the original papers." I didn't make a sound. I simply stood in the hallway and listened. There are moments in life when your instincts beg you to burst through a door, demand answers, and force everyone to explain themselves. Every part of me wanted to do exactly that. But after 40 years of running a business, I'd learned one lesson that never failed me. People reveal the most when they don't know they're being watched. So I stood in that hallway without making a sound, my hand resting against the wall to steady myself, and listened to the people I had trusted more than anyone else. My son's voice came first, "It's not here." Then my wife answered, surprisingly calm. He must have moved it. He never changes his routine unless he's suspicious. A chill ran through me. They weren't guessing. They were studying me. My daughter sighed impatiently. If he updates the will before we figure this out, everything could change. Those words settled any doubt I still had. This wasn't idle conversation anymore. They weren't simply talking about what might happen after I died. They were actively trying to stay one step ahead of me while believing I was still 2 steps behind them. I quietly backed away from the hallway, stepped outside through the side entrance, and deliberately slammed the front gate before walking back in through the front door. "I'm home," I called out. The voices stopped instantly. A few seconds later, my wife appeared from the kitchen, wiping perfectly dry hands on a dish towel. "Oh," she smiled, "you're back early." "I couldn't finish my walk," I replied casually. "Thought I'd come home and rest." My son walked out of my office holding an old photo album. "I was just showing the kids some family pictures," he said. He even laughed. It was a good performance. If I hadn't heard the conversation myself, I might have believed him. Instead, I smiled right back. I'm glad someone's finally looking through those memories. That evening, after everyone left, I drove straight to my attorney's office again. When I finished telling him what had happened, he remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he opened a legal pad and drew a line straight down the middle of the page. "They've shown us who they are," he said. "Now we decide what kind of ending this story deserves." I looked at him. "I don't want revenge." He nodded. "I know. I want the truth to become expensive." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he smiled. "That's called justice." Over the next week, we began making changes, but not the kind my family expected. The house remained in my name. The investment accounts stayed exactly where they were. Nothing visible changed. Behind the scenes, however, every important document was reviewed, updated, and secured. Multiple copies were stored in different locations. Independent executors replaced family members in key roles. Clear written explanations accompanied every decision so no one could later claim confusion or manipulation. Most importantly, we created one final document that no one in my family knew existed. It wasn't written out of anger. It was written out of clarity. It explained exactly why each decision had been made, supported by dates, observations, and facts, not accusations. If anyone challenged my choices, they would first have to explain their own behavior. Meanwhile, at home, my family grew even more confident. They mistook my calmness for weakness. My occasional forgetfulness convinced them I was becoming easier to influence. Their conversations became bolder. Their patience became shorter. Then my wife answered, surprisingly calm. He must have moved it. He never changes his routine unless he's suspicious. A chill ran through me. They weren't guessing. They were studying me. My daughter sighed impatiently. If he updates the will before we figure this out, everything could change. Those words settled any doubt I still had. This wasn't idle conversation anymore. They weren't simply talking about what might happen after I died. They were actively trying to stay one step ahead of me while believing I was still 2 steps behind them. I quietly backed away from the hallway, stepped outside through the side entrance, and deliberately slammed the front gate before walking back in through the front door. "I'm home," I called out. The voices stopped instantly. A few seconds later, my wife appeared from the kitchen, wiping perfectly dry hands on a dish towel. "Oh," she smiled. "You're back early." "I couldn't finish my walk," I replied casually. "Thought I'd come home and rest." My son walked out of my office holding an old photo album. "I was just showing the kids some family pictures," he said. He even laughed. It was a good performance. If I hadn't heard the conversation myself, I might have believed him. Instead, I smiled right back. I'm glad someone's finally looking through those memories. That evening, after everyone left, I drove straight to my attorney's office again. When I finished telling him what had happened, he remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he opened a legal pad and drew a line straight down the middle of the page. "They've shown us who they are," he said. "Now we decide what kind of ending this story deserves." I looked at him. "I don't want revenge." He nodded. "I know. I want the truth to become expensive." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he smiled. "That's called justice." Over the next week, we began making changes, but not the kind my family expected. The house remained in my name. The investment accounts stayed exactly where they were. Nothing visible changed. Behind the scenes, however, every important document was reviewed, updated, and secured. Multiple copies were stored in different locations. Independent executors replaced family members in key roles. Clear written explanations accompanied every decision so no one could later claim confusion or manipulation. Most importantly, we created one final document that no one in my family knew existed. It wasn't written out of anger. It was written out of clarity. It explained exactly why each decision had been made, supported by dates, observations, and facts, not accusations. If anyone challenged my choices, they would first have to explain their own behavior. Meanwhile, at home, my family grew even more confident. They mistook my calmness for weakness. My occasional forgetfulness convinced them I was becoming easier to influence. Their conversations became bolder. Their patience became shorter. And then my wife suggested something that almost made me admire the boldness of it. She smiled across the dinner table and said, "Thomas, I think it's time we had a family meeting to talk about your future." I looked around the table at every face watching me. Then I smiled warmly and answered, "I couldn't agree more." None of them realized I'd already scheduled one of my own. Have you ever watched someone walk confidently into a trap they built for themselves? The remarkable thing about greed is that it creates its own blindness. By the time my wife suggested the family meeting, everyone around that table believed they were in control. They thought I was an old man, reluctantly accepting that his best years were behind him. They had no idea I was simply giving them more time to prove exactly who they were. The meeting was set for the following Saturday afternoon. My wife insisted it should be just family. She said we needed to discuss my future, my health, and how everyone could help me if I ever became unable to manage things on my own. She spoke with such tenderness that, had I not overheard those conversations weeks earlier, I might have been grateful. Instead, I thanked her. "I appreciate all of you worrying about me," I said. My son reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder. "We only want what's best for you, Dad." I almost believed him. Almost. On Friday morning, I had one final meeting with my attorney. Every document had been signed. Every account had been reviewed. Every legal safeguard was in place. There would be no dramatic courtroom surprise, no trick hidden in a briefcase. Real justice isn't built on theatrics. It's built on preparation. Before I left, my attorney handed me a sealed envelope. "Don't open this," he said. "Just bring it tomorrow." "What is it?" "The truth," he replied. "And tomorrow everyone will have to face it." I slipped the envelope into my briefcase without another question. Saturday arrived. By 2 o'clock, the house was full. Coffee cups sat untouched on the table. My wife looked unusually cheerful. My daughter had brought a notebook. My son had a folder of his own, claiming he'd prepared a list of ways to simplify my finances. Even my daughter-in-law kept reminding everyone how important it was to make these decisions while I was still able to participate. That choice of words didn't escape me. Able to participate. Not capable of deciding. Not in control. Just participating. When everyone had taken their seats, my wife cleared her throat. "Thomas," she began gently, "we've all noticed you've been forgetting little things lately. We think it might be time to consider giving someone power of attorney just in case." No one spoke. They all looked at me, waiting, expecting, hoping. I lowered my eyes as if I were embarrassed. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. The relief on their faces was impossible to hide. My son immediately opened his folder. "We've already looked into the paperwork. It's really just a formality." A formality. Reducing a lifetime of independence to a formality. I let him continue. He explained how much easier life would be if someone else handled my banking, investments, and property decisions. My daughter nodded at every sentence. My wife occasionally reached over to pat my hand, as though comforting me through a decision she'd already made in her mind. When he finally finished, the room fell silent. I looked slowly at every face around the table. Then I reached beside my chair and placed my own briefcase on the table. "I agree," I said calmly. Their smiles grew wider. "I think paperwork is very important." I opened the briefcase, pulled out the sealed envelope, and placed it in the center of the table. Before anyone could ask what it was, the front doorbell rang. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "That," I said quietly, "will be my attorney." In an instant, every confident expression around the table began to fade, because they suddenly realized this wasn't their family meeting. It was mine. The silence that followed the doorbell was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that house. For years, it had been filled with birthday songs, holiday laughter, and the ordinary sounds of a family growing together. Now it was filled with something else entirely. Fear. I stood up slowly and opened the front door. My attorney stepped inside, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He greeted everyone politely, but no one returned his smile. My wife looked confused. My son looked irritated. My daughter suddenly found the table fascinating. I invited him to sit beside me. "Thank you for coming," I said. He nodded, placed the portfolio on the table, and looked around the room. "Mr. Thomas asked me to be present because he recently completed a full review of his estate and financial affairs." No one moved. My son finally broke the silence. "Dad, what's all this?" I looked at him calmly. "This is the family meeting." He leaned back, the confidence he'd worn for weeks slipping away. My attorney opened the portfolio and removed several documents. "Over the past month," he began, "Mr. Thomas has updated his will, established an independent trust, appointed a professional executor, and documented the reasons behind every decision." My wife's face turned pale. "What reasons?" she whispered. Instead of answering, I slid a handwritten letter across the table. I wrote that myself. No anger, no insults, just the truth. It described the evening I sat in the next room listening as my family divided my home, my savings, my watches, and even discussed how to manage things after I was gone. It described finding them searching my office. It described the questions about my accounts and the pressure to hand over control of my life. When they finished reading, no one looked at me. Not because they were ashamed enough to apologize, because every word was true. My attorney spoke again. "Mr. Thomas decided that wealth should never reward greed. Therefore, his estate has been distributed according to character rather than expectation. The lake house would be sold, with the proceeds funding scholarships for young people entering the construction trades, the profession that had given me everything. A large portion of my investments would support a local veterans charity and the Children's Hospital, where my late brother had spent his final days. The rest would provide for my retirement and future care, managed independently, so I would never again have to wonder whether someone's kindness came from love or from anticipation. My family wasn't left completely empty-handed. Each of them received a modest amount, along with one sentence from my letter. Love given for an inheritance was never love at all. No one argued. There was nothing to argue with. They hadn't lost because of a clever lawyer or a hidden document. They had lost the moment they chose to value my possessions more than my presence. As my attorney gathered his papers, I looked around the room one last time. "I spent my whole life believing I was building an inheritance," I said quietly. "What I should have been building was a way to recognize who truly deserved it." Then I picked up my coat and walked out to the porch. The lake was perfectly still. For the first time in weeks, so was my heart. Because I finally understood something that no amount of money could ever buy. The greatest justice isn't watching greedy people lose your wealth. It's watching them realize they lost you long before they lost the inheritance.